Anything or it's all we got. It's all we're going to deal with.
No, that's too early.
Oh, okay.
So,
Yeah, that's what yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
I usually start at like 30 up.
I've got a copy of it. I wrote a statement. Minor action. You do your email.
Well, all right.
I know, I could hardly even tell it when I started.
Yeah. But all she knows me as is the shovel boy, so let's keep it like that.
Very professional.
Right? I agree that Tom was a great choice to be in charge. Of this, you know.
Those two words don't say that together.
Well, I'm just bringing it back. Wow. You saw what they're eating too. He's teaching class.
Meaning I did before. Oh, it was.
It's always that sunset tree.
Yeah. Eric, have I done that before? Really? Wow. No. I wouldn't accept a preacher that did stuff like that. Yeah, that's what it. Yeah. No. What's going to happen is people are going to think, I think he's just recycling old lessons. I'm curious how many people notice. That's the thing to see. It was a test, really. Well, let's go ahead and get our Bibles out. We're going over to Nehemiah chapter 5 tonight. Nehemiah chapter 5. If it's not one thing, it's another. That'd be Nehemiah's motto. Trying to get a job done, and he's just struggling. Chapter 4, wow, all the different things he had to deal with there, different his enemies that were plotting against him. They actually wanted to get an army together to attack him. Of course, he's got all these workers, and people are kind of losing all their strength and their interest in things, and it really is something. And now Nehemiah's going to have to deal with some problems inside, too. And those are going to be a doozy. Before we get started, let's go to our Father in word of prayer. Would you join me? Holy God and Father in heaven, we love you and we thank you that you gave us opportunities to come together like this, encouraging each other, Father, just to see each other and to open up your word and to delve in, Father, and see how it is that godly people deal with difficult situations. Father, we're grateful for Nehemiah's experience and his example to us. And we pray, Father, that we'll walk away refreshed and encouraged as we face different difficulties in our lives. Father, we thank you for the blessings that come by our relationship with you. And in the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. Nehemiah chapter 5. Chapter begins that there is a great outcry. Great outcry. What's a great outcry? Complaint. No, Israelites don't complain. Well, this one's a little more serious, though. This great outcry. Somebody tell me about it. If you got to do the reading for tonight, chapter 5, tell me about what it was that the great outcry. What they were mad at, like the Samaritans or the Ammonites, right? No, he says no. Who were they mad at? They were mad at their Jewish brethren. They were mad at their Jewish brethren. And what was the problem? What was it that they were upset about? Money, interest rates. What else? No food. And one more. Yeah. And what did they do to solve all this? Yeah. Now, it's kind of an interesting thing to talk about here. And I don't know how far we want to go into this. But the issue is that they're poor, that there are, somebody said, say it again, the term for high interest rates, there's a special word for that. Usury, yeah, high interest rates. We have laws against that, but there's a lot of ways that people get around it. But high interest rates where you're charging a ridiculous amount of money to borrow money. So those are problems certainly that people had as well. And the whole idea here is that these people were crying out because they were saying they were being victimized. Well, the first thing I want to think about here is what exactly was the sin that was involved in this? All right, the law of Moses. Let's jump over there and talk about this for a second. You want to jump over? I think let's start in Deuteronomy chapter 22. I've written them down, but I'm not seeing them now. Exodus chapter 22. By the way, I've always thought it's interesting that Exodus 22 is right after the Ten Commandments. That thing that they talk about almost right away. Chapter 22, verse 25 says the following: If you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like the moneylender to him. You shall not charge him interest. Now, a little bit of further qualification later on. I'll talk about the nature of interest and what that amounts to. But the important point to consider here is the moneylender was the person that was charging interest, and he says, I don't want you to be like that. Going on there, if we go to the next passage to consider in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 24, we get a little more about it. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, beginning at verse 10, when you lend your brother anything, you shall not go into his house for a pledge. Verse 11, you shall stand outside, and the men whom you lend shall bring the pledge to you. And if the man is poor, you shall not keep his pledge overnight. You shall in any case return the pledge to him again when the sun goes down, that he may sleep in his own garment and bless you, and it shall be righteous to you before the Lord. What's interesting about this idea, of course, the idea of usury, the Catholic Church picked up on that. Let me ask you a question. Is it a sin to charge interest to your brethren? No, nothing in the New Testament is mentioned about that. But I would say that, it might be less than generous. It might be less than hospitable or the like. So we might consider that. But honestly, I've known brethren that were bankers. And, of course they're going to charge interest. That's part of their business plan and their purpose. So we want to be careful to say this was an Old Testament teaching. Catholic Church in the Middle Ages practiced this idea that they wouldn't allow it. What did that lead to? Anybody know from a historical standpoint what happened because of that?
Medicis were the big bankers for the church.
Yeah, so
corrupted.
You ended up with just a few groups. A lot of times they were the Jewish groups, or a few groups that bypassed those laws, and then became very rich by being the money lenders. So kind of an interesting thing to think about there. So this is always a matter of some contention and problem. This idea of the loaning of money in Leviticus. One more passage we look at in chapter 25, verse 42. Talking not so much about usury, but about the language or the characteristics of what it meant for somebody who was in debt. Chapter 25 there, verse 42. And we find the following. He makes a statement talking about what's called the year of Jubilee. He says, actually, let's go back to verse 39. If one of your brethren who dwells with you becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant, and a sojourner he shall be to you, and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. And then he shall depart from you, and he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family, he and his fathers, for the possession of his servants. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. So, God had a lot of different rules about this. But of course, what we're seeing here is that people that were broke, verse 3 says, well, we had to eat, we were hungry, we mortgaged our lands and our vineyards and our houses. Those who said we have borrowed money for the king's tax on our lands, now our flesh is the flesh of our brethren, our children are as their children, and indeed we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves. Some of our daughters have been bought into slavery. It is not in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards. So what are the problems here? Again, we said usury is a problem, but what's at the heart of these things? And by the way, this was a problem for a long time. What is it the Israelites are not practicing here? The law of Moses, last passage we just read, said they had to practice. Somebody said Jubilee. Yeah. Well, actually, yeah, slavery. Because he specifically said your brethren are not to be your slaves, they're to be your bondservants. So it's making a distinction there and how they're being changed. And they're saying this. Somebody said the year of Jubilee. What's the year of Jubilee? Teresa?
Every seventh year, the lands go back to the original owners.
Yes, every seventh year, every seventh year was the year of fallow, and then the year of Jubilee too. At 50 years, the land returned back. But, the idea of being a servant, you didn't serve more than 7 years. So are these people being released at that time? No. Tell me this, the 7th year rest, for example, the 7th year Sabbath, has that been a problem before? Yeah, so much so that whenever Israel was taken into captivity, God says, you guys owe me 70 Sabbath years. So he puts it back in. Yeah. So what's neat about that is that this has always been a problem. And in Jeremiah's time, they were rebuked for not having celebrated the Jubilee and letting their people free. And so they said, well, we'll do it. And then they took them all back. Just didn't want to do it. So this is a pretty serious thing. Now, by the way, what's interesting about the ideas here, first of all, who is it that they're in debt to who have bought all this stuff? I mean, it must be these evil Samaritans and such that they borrowed money from. Yeah, their brothers. Who? The nobles. Yeah, their own people are the people that, by the way, you could make the case to say the people that are supposed to be supporting and taking care of them are the people that they are borrowing money from and having to go into slavery to. And this is outrageous because what Nehemiah's come to do is he's come to bring everybody together to work, and what he's kind of finding out is people are saying, yeah, I wish I could work, but you know what? This guy owes me, and he's done it for years. What prompted this, by the way? What was it that made this happen? What was it that started all this?
The building of the wall.
Well, that's what started his interest in these things, but what started the slavery? Why was it these people were in trouble in the first place? Verse 3 tells us. They didn't have any food. Why? Yeah, there was a famine. Now, what's interesting is we just get a little touch of this. We actually kind of have to step back and go back to the Old Testament prophets to find a little more about this, because one of the prophets, in the time of Zerubbabel, said that there was a famine. Anybody know who? It was the prophet Haggai. He says there's a famine. He says God's not giving you provision because you're not building and finishing the temple. And so there was a famine way back. Kind of wonder if that implies the idea that this has been going on for many, many decades. You know, the interesting thing about slavery, it's a tough conversation. It makes a lot of people uncomfortable. The slavery of the Old Testament that the Bible set out, it's really important to understand that it really was a very different thing than things that we might be familiar with. For one thing, probably the law of Moses might be the first. They had a very succinct, you could say, a Bill of Rights about how to treat people who had been enslaved. Anybody know any of those rules? What were some of the things you couldn't do? Well, how about an easy one? What day of the week could they not work? Yeah, so right away, you couldn't work them on the Sabbath. We've already mentioned that if they were an Israelite, they had to be set free after a certain amount of time, and they had still to be paid. So there's that sentence too. Now, even a Gentile who was a slave, the laws like eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, applied to those situations. So if you abused them, what? Be brought right back on you, and circumstances like that. So right off the top, we want to be clear that the circumstances at that time were a very different thing. Now, how did somebody become a slave back in those days? We've kind of gotten a hint at one. What's the one here?
So.
Yeah, debt. Yeah. Debt's probably, throughout history, debt's probably the most common reason people have ended up like that. By the way, even in England up until the 1700s, you would be thrown into debtor's prison, which might be something like that if you had a debt that you weren't able to pay. So it was a pretty serious thing even in those times. Interesting thing, though, the Bible, the Old Testament, and probably even in the New Testament, explicitly condemned the idea of somebody who went out for the purpose of finding somebody to enslave them. In the New Testament, 1 Timothy chapter 1, it's referred to by the term kidnappers, which the term there in Greek referred to somebody who went out to acquire slaves. And God expressly said that anybody who does that was to be put to death. So that the only way that people could become enslaved was because of financial circumstances or if they had been captured in war. And God was explicit about that. And so what's interesting is the Israelites had a lot of trouble with these rules, just like the nations around them too. And so we have this circumstance that I think is interesting to point out. Verse 6, I became very angry, and so after serious thought, I rebuked the nobles. Now what's interesting about that, I rebuked the nobles and the rulers. Why is that, as we kind of go on and talk about the characteristics, is saying I'm going to rebuke them, why is that such a serious thing? Why is that kind of was that a good idea, Nehemiah? I mean, of course you'd say he deserved it, but why is that kind of serious or dangerous? Nehemiah, he's been here a long time, right? He's kind of gotten the lay of the land and goes, no, he's been here weeks. Now, when he gets here, who does he rely, like a governor, need to rely on for his authority, for his work? Yeah, these very people that he pulls in, and he begins to rebuke them. So I think it's fascinating. Just there a few weeks. These are the people that he needs to kind of have on his side and things. But the problem is serious enough, and it says that, in the New King James, serious thought, I rebuked them and said to them, you're exacting usury. I called a great assembly against them. So in other words, he said, I took them to court. And I said, according to our ability, we redeemed our Jewish treasure and sold to the nations. In other words, we just went to a lot of trouble to get people out of slavery here, and now look at what you're doing. Or should they be sold to us? So how do the rulers and nobles initially respond to this? But Stephen, go ahead.
He actually, as I understand, spent a lot of his own personal money.
Yes, and what's really neat at the end of this time is that, being the governor had a lot of benefits, but what are we going to find out? He's not going to take them. Oh, I love Nehemiah. Yeah, he's not going to take any of the perks that come with his job, and that's a really interesting thing. How do they respond to this? What's their first statement? Yeah, so they're exactly right. They don't know what to say. What can they say, right? In part that I'm sure they're shocked that he would even say this, and I want to point out this. Nehemiah, it seems like he doesn't want to humiliate them. He doesn't want to, he doesn't want them, ashamed and in such a degree that they, can't lift up. He says, what you're doing is not good. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of the Lord because of the reproach of the nations, our enemies? I also with my brethren and my servants am lending them money and grain. Stop. In other words, look at my example. Look, I'm doing it this way, and you need to as well. Stop this. Restore it to them. So, what was their follow-up to this? What is he says, put it away. What did they do?
Something was
Yeah. Now, like I said, what's interesting here is Nehemiah. Maybe I like to think it like this. Nehemiah pulls out the hammer, and he says, "How about you guys just do the right thing?" They said, "Yeah, that's a great idea." And I think that's kind of what we're seeing here. He brought in the assembly. They could, they're like, well, he's really serious about this. And then he says, why don't you guys do what I'm doing? Why don't you just restore? And they say, yeah, that's what we're going to do. We'll restore. Interesting, like I said, that this has been something that has happened before in the time of Jeremiah. They said, yeah, we'll restore, but they kind of didn't. So what does Nehemiah do? Yeah, he makes it legal. Or, I don't know what we'd call it, but called the priests. They signed the oath. I shook out the fold of my garment, and he said, may God shake out each man from his house and his property who doesn't perform this promise. And by the way, who hears all that? The assembly, the court. And by the way, assembly could mean a lot of things. It could be the early, it's kind of a neat thought, it could be the early images of the Sanhedrin, or it could just be a great collection of all the people who've been working with hammers and swords, by the way. So, a group of people you want, and they say, yes, Stephen.
One commentary I was reading was saying that a lot of these nobles really did not agree with Nehemiah very much, and much as priesthood was against him. So he really had a lot of adversaries. Them should be unanimously agree with this.
Yeah.
See,
I think what it is Nehemiah. So Stephen, I let me just tell you what I think. So I'm going to be careful here. It's just an I think. I think that Nehemiah was smart to bring it out in front of everybody and kind of put that pressure of, I don't want to be the guy that says, I'm not going to forgive these people. Whenever Nehemiah just said, I'm going to give them, that what they need and no usury. Who's with me? And, who wants to look like the bad guy? I really think Nehemiah was great about, I don't want to say manipulating, but kind of making the moment feel like, I don't really feel like there's really much of a choice here, especially since we're a little scared about what Nehemiah might else do on this circumstance.
Well, and like I said, by doing this, they are breaking the law of Moses. Nehemiah would be justified in pursuing a penalty against them, but it seems like it's giving them an opportunity to fix their issues without him.
Yeah, that's really pretty neat. How that is the case. And by the way, it's kind of interesting to say that, if there was a set penalty, Nehemiah's position to grant mercy, was that appropriate? I guess it's not an easy answer for that, maybe, but I think so. I think that his position as a leader of the people, he had some appropriate means by which to make mercy. But it's interesting how he makes it clear that's what he's going to do. Anybody else have any comments about this recently?
I have a question.
Okay.
At this point, were they sacrificing yet?
So we know they started sacrifices right back whenever they first, they first built the altar right away to sacrifice, and we saw some sacrifices at the time that the temple was completed 60 years before. So Teresa, your question might be more like, are they regularly sacrificing?
Yeah, because I was wondering, this would be something they should be offering sacrifices for.
Oh, that's right. So Teresa, what do you think? Which is to say, Brian doesn't really know the answer for sure.
I don't know. I mean, there's no mention that they sacrificed, but they should have. I mean, this was sinful, and they should have sacrificed for what they had done.
Yeah. So it's interesting to say there's not a conversation. One thing is there is a conversation about the nature or the character of the high priest at this time. It was mentioned a second ago, high priests really aren't all with Nehemiah. What's the issue with the high priests? The high priest's family and maybe the priests themselves, Greater?
I learned earlier that many of them didn't have, they weren't married properly.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Also, many of them may have not come from the tribe of Levi. Their genealogy was not correct.
Yeah, we found that one out early on. I wasn't even thinking about that, but that's a good one. I was thinking more about what Nehemiah found out when he got there. What was the story with the high priest? Who was he related to in marriage?
Oh, he was related to the governor. And
Yes.
And
So he's, I think, Tobiah's grandson, or we're going to find out again here in the next chapter. But the point was that they're kind of in the pocket of these other guys, too. So going back to Teresa's question, well, one problem is the priests really are kind of dubious in priests. Now, Teresa, I want to throw out there to say that the Old Testament, a lot of people would agree with this, a lot of commentators would agree with this. We think that the Israelites were really, really bad about the sacrificial system before captivity. We think that they didn't do it very often. We don't think they did the Passover very often. Some people think that maybe those few times, like when Josiah does it and Hezekiah does it, Those might even be the only times they've done it, that they just didn't regularly observe these things. We have, like in Josiah's time, Hilkiah says, hey, look at this funny book. It's the law. Hilkiah, you're supposed to be the master of it. And he doesn't even know it. How could he have been doing sacrifices? They might have just been doing whatever they wanted. It was probably a real mess. And what's interesting is that the priest system here of a connection to Tobiah kind of mirrors the priest system when? In the New Testament. Very good, Anthony, because in the New Testament, we have
Annas.
Annas, Caiaphas, thank you. Annas, Caiaphas, later on, Ananias, we meet as a high priest, and they're all in these close connections with the Roman rulers and corrupt and problematic. They might be a little better about the sacrificial system, but the problem is they're not doing what they ought to be doing. I think it's interesting that you kind of can see that here, but we see it in a bigger way in the New Testament as well, that corruption in the priesthood that I've always thought was really interesting. Good question. Anybody else have a thought to say?
Do you think Nehemiah could have been looked at, because if he'd have been taking and using his position as governor, he could have been using that to accumulate lands and get rich, like it goes on in a couple more verses, but he didn't do that.
So what's really interesting about what you're saying there is that there's a big deal about the nature of Nehemiah's, ethic of position. So what you said a second ago, you said, what could he have done with that position?
He could have put his finger on the people and collected taxes, and he didn't.
Nobody ever did that, right?
Oh, everybody did it. But
That's right. That's right.
The nobles can't say you're a hypocrite because you're saying we can't do it.
Yes.
He didn't do it, so they couldn't say that.
And I think, by the way, that's why what we're reading next is right on the tail of this conversation, because it's contrasting the priests who are supposed to be the defenders of the people, or the nobles, the elders of Israel, who are supposed to be the shepherds of Israel. And by the way, Zechariah talked about, he said they were the worthless shepherds he talked about, but, the shepherds of Israel. And then you got, by the way, the Persian governor, who you would expect what? To be the guy that's defrauding, and yet we're reversing that. And we're about to say, that governor, he's bypassing all the perks of office, and instead, he's putting it back to the people. And that's extraordinary. Stephen? Oh, Grant?
I was just going to go back to what Teresa talked about earlier about the feasts. In a couple chapters, we find out that they're going to celebrate the Feast of Booths for the first time since it says Joshua.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's still things that they're not doing right.
Yeah. And by the way, I just don't know what a statement like that means. Does it literally mean that they hadn't celebrated the Feast of Booths since Joshua, which, by the way, that was one of the 3 feasts they were obligated to go to Jerusalem? Is it really mean they didn't do it? And what do we say? That's what it says. I can't wrap my brain around the fact that they could have been that bad at worship.
Yeah, but it does seem at least that here in this time they have to do it.
And what's kind of interesting about that is that we kind of think it's a little bit of a from now on that they get better about it. Of course, the time of Jesus, we know that they're restored a lot of this. And remember, we talked about this in Luke. It's really important that Jesus is in a time frame where those things could be done. We don't appreciate the fact that Jesus come 1,000 years before, there was no high priest, no tabernacle, that Jesus could have been in a technical default of the law because there was no way to do it, that in the time of Christ, the fact that those things were operating is a big deal. And it's worth considering what it took to get from a system that was broken to the system that was marginally working in the time of Jesus so that he could fulfill these things even as a child, as a baby. We talked about how important that was. But the point is that these Ezra, Nehemiah is the place where we see the change of an Israel that can't do anything right to starts to think it might be important. And most people say that's probably because of Ezra. That Ezra is the guy that kind of helps Israel get back on track and really bring forward things to the time of Christ. Kind of went off a little bit on that. That's a really important point for us to consider. So Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 14. What we find out is that as he was appointed governor of the land, it says from the 20th to the 32nd year. So he was a 12 year. And the governor's provisions. What do you think the governor's provisions are like? Provisions. What does that mean, maybe? Taxes, yeah. And by the way, taxes wasn't just money, right? Food, wine, yeah, that's right. It was all sorts of things. Governor's supposed to eat whatever he wants. He's supposed to be sumptuous. Al already said it, let's say it again. These were oftentimes positions that you got in as a reward for having, been friendly to the governor. Herod was Herod's father, Herod the Great's father, Antipater. He was made the king of Judea because he had supported Julius Caesar. And so the idea was you're put in that position to get yourself rich. That's why you become governor. Not because you say, I want to help people, things like that. You want to make money. And so what's fascinating is here in Nehemiah it says, you know what? I didn't actually take the provisions of the governor. Now, I did point out, the governors before me did, they laid burdens on the people, bread, wine, shekels of silver. Even their servants bore rule over the people. I didn't. Why not? What's the, what's Nehemiah's reason that I didn't do it? The fear of the Lord. I love it. The fear of the Lord. We talk about the fear of the Lord in the New Testament oftentimes. We talk about how, the book of Proverbs, what does it say about the fear of the Lord? It's the beginning of knowledge, beginning of wisdom, yes. But here's this idea of the fear of the Lord. I love the idea that Nehemiah says, I'm not going to mess with this by the fear of the Lord. That's right. That's very good. That's actually a defining proverb. Yes, it does. And one thing I like to think is that, it's interesting. You think, well, what does this mean about Nehemiah? Job in Job 31, one of my favorite chapters, I like to talk about the Job 31 man, kind of like the Proverbs 31 woman. In Job 31, Job says, here's what integrity is, and he goes through this list of things he'd never do. But each time he talks about, I wouldn't dare do this to somebody because I know God's watching. I wouldn't mistreat my servants, he'll say, because I'm God's servant. I wouldn't want him to do that to me. I wouldn't trust my land because I know God gave it to me and I wouldn't want him to be angry with me. And what's fascinating is he goes through this list and every time he's saying, I wouldn't do this because I wouldn't want God as my adversary. And it's a really neat chapter because he's just talking about day-to-day things like, how do I plow my fields? How do I treat my servants? How do I treat my friends? What do I do with the poor around me? And every one of them he says, I do it because I know there's a God. And that scares me. Not that he ran around in terror of God, but because he knew that if he was ungodly and unfair, God knew. God knew. That's just such a neat idea to see it like this, that this idea that God knew and he had this fear. And here he says, I didn't do it because of the fear of the Lord. Kind of wraps up with him talking about what was, the people that did join him. Finally, one more of those little tiny prayers of Nehemiah that I think is so neat. How does this kind of fit with something that Paul did in 1 Corinthians 9? The Apostle Paul was writing to the church in Corinth, and he told them, I have the right from the scriptures to receive what? Wages, support from you. But what? He didn't. He says, I've given up that right. I've foregone it for your sake. So it's a really interesting thing to kind of tie these two characteristics together of people who say, I had a right. I'm going to pass that up, George. Yeah? Yeah, I've always wondered if Paul might have been a little sarcastic when he said, forgive me, this wrong. But I don't think so. I think it was, maybe they should have understood. Maybe he should have had them do it and understand it. So. Yeah, very much so. Anybody else have a comment about this chapter? Go ahead. Go on.
Let's look at 17 and 18. Talks about what Nehemiah is providing. So he's actually brought a lot of wealth with him. And it puts him in a position where he doesn't have to exact usury as some others around are doing. He's providing 750 rulers, and there's others, so he's doing this every day to take care of a pretty large group.
And what's interesting is that right after that, he says it a second time, but I did not seek the governor's wage, which is to say, if you've been doing this for 12 years, what would it be like by the end of that time? What kind of, what would Nehemiah's Remember we said Nehemiah as the cupbearer is in a position to be one of the richest people in the Persian Empire. So for the next 12 years, every day, he does this. So what do you think at the end of the 12 years he was like? But he wasn't the richest, one of the richest people around him. I can't help but wonder if he didn't impoverish himself. Doesn't say it, let's be clear. But he was, so what's the expression sometimes we use? He was bleeding money. He was bleeding expenses and refuses to take anything from his brethren. Pretty impressive. Pretty impressive that he's doing that. And again, we have to kind of account to that's going to create this stability. So the remarkable thing is, and let's kind of pull all this together. Here he is, the leader that gives things up. It's a fantastic leadership quality to say somebody who, I'm going to, deny myself and I'm going to help you. And he's the guy out there digging with them and working with them. And so what's the result of that kind of work? Well, the next question is, how much the work gets done here? Verse 1, it says, what do they do? They rebuild the wall. 12 years. How long? 52 days. The point, of course, we haven't quite got to that point yet, but the point we want to say is that this is unbelievable. You think it was a miracle, how that might be the case, but he's done it in 52 days. But what we've been told behind the scenes is there's enough people. He is willing to make sacrifices himself, and people want to follow him. Even his enemies, people that aren't necessarily his friends among the Jews, are accepting, acknowledging the difficulty here. So he's got those enemies. We didn't talk about them in the last chapter. Those enemies on the outside, he's got Sanballat, he's got Tobiah, Geshem. I want to say Gresham. Don't offend anybody in Gresham. So he's got Geshem. They're the enemies. They hear this. So what do they do? What is it that they propose? What could suggest? Yeah, we need to talk. Now, by the way, remember, we said Tobiah is a governor. Sanballat, we actually know is a governor, from the heart of the scriptures. Geshem is probably a ruler. Let's have a, royalty conference. Is that unreasonable? Well, that makes sense. Let's come get together, talk. So they send this out, and Nehemiah says, yeah, I'm busy that day. Essentially, it says, of course, we're going to kind of go through this. How many times do they do it? 4 times. Why do they keep asking? Why do they keep asking? What's the point here? Yeah, come on. Well, every time he says, I'm busy. Oh, okay. And call him, send him another, hey, you come. Oh, I can't do it. Come, send him another one. Can't do it. Maybe he'll come. 4 times he doesn't do it. So do we keep doing it this way? What's the new approach the 5th time? Yeah, what kind of trick?
Hey, I'm reporting this to the boss.
Yes. So, by the way, I've always said that what's interesting in the trial of Jesus, especially in the book of John, in John chapter 19, is that Pilate is constantly resisting having Jesus put to death. The Bible gives us, what do we say, 7 times that Pilate acts in a way to get Jesus set free. What's the ultimate thing that they get Pilate with that he gives up on? Yeah, they said, this guy says he's a king, and anybody who's a friend to Caesar wouldn't be helping this guy in him. So that's a pretty serious thing. Because if we write a letter back to the Persian emperor, who maybe, like I said, it's been a little while since he's been there. I know it's only been, we're talking about days on the wall, but months to travel. Reported that you and the Jews rebel. Remember that old, let's look up the history of this city and see what they're like. Oh, yeah. And according to these rumors, you're rebuilding the wall, that you may be their king. You've even appointed prophets to proclaim this. What's Persia going to say? What's the Persian king going to say?
We're good friends with Nehemiah.
Yeah. He is friends with Nehemiah, but you know what I think? I don't think he'd have a choice. it's not like these kingdoms aren't really stable. I mentioned it before that somebody had murdered his father and he had to, take over in a pretty rough way. And so you never quite know who's out there. And somebody shows up and says, hey, this guy's taking it. And even if he says, oh, that's Nehemiah, he's okay. Somebody else might say, oh, that's not the king. He has to respond. He has to respond hard.
Well, and the Persians were absolutely famous for following the rule of law.
Yes.
And even if I would think that in the end Nehemiah would have been fine because it would have sussed out that it was a fake, but he would, as you pointed out, would have had to do something, at least investigate it, at least come and send somebody to look into it. It would have had to have been done.
Yes.
I also like the fact that Nehemiah is like, yeah, this is a lie, and really does not seem to be worried about it because his reputation is such that I think he's comfortable enough in his own reputation that he knows that it would be found to be false.
I'm fascinated with Nehemiah's, we know it's a lie. Get back to work, guys. I'm fascinated with that. Here they come up and I got a great idea. Let's write this. And Nehemiah, that's a lie. I've got other things to do. He seems so just straightforward about this. As he goes back, he says, you're inventing this. And I think verse 9 is important. You're inventing this because you want to make us afraid. Stephen?
I think it's really important in verse 5 that he's sent out as sending an open letter, meaning anybody can read it. The messenger, the words, all these things that Nehemiah's doing. And I have to wonder if the first 4 letters didn't also here is sort of an open letter to just spread the word to everybody in the land. So that's what he's doing.
Stephen, I didn't catch that. That's a really interesting point, the language of the open letter. I had to pick that up on that, so I really appreciate that. I hadn't thought about that. A neat point to think about, the idea that this would be something that everybody, that it's an everybody kind of application. I'm not worried. And then at the end of verse 9, but God, please help me. I think he's a little worried. But I think the point is, if you're not acting on it, then you're not really. Afterward, I came to the house of Shimei. Now, Shimei is kind of an interesting story. I'm going to throw some questions. These aren't any of your questions, so you're going to say, Brian, I wasn't ready. I don't care. I'm kind of heartless. I'm no Nehemiah. So Shemaiah is the son, and it gives us, and Shemaiah's position was a secret informer. So he's one of these guys that's in the pocket of these other rulers. And Shemaiah says, it's kind of a strange thing. How would you describe it? Call it a prophecy. It doesn't feel like a prophecy. But what does he say here in verse 10? What's his suggestion? Yeah, they're coming to kill you, Nehemiah. We're hiding the temple. Well, that's an interesting statement. Where did this information actually come from? Verse 12 says, yeah, he'd been paid to do this. Now, this is kind of neat. Not neat, it's terrible, I shouldn't say. But it's interesting what he's trying to do here. Nehemiah talks about this. The first thing he says is, I perceived God hadn't sent this. I could tell this wasn't a thing of God. And he says, in verse 13, he says he did this. What was the issue? He says he did this so that I should be afraid and should act in that way and sin. Now, tell me real quick, why? What's the sin here? We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. And we said there's a strong indication about something that this statement solidifies or helps us out. What's the issue?
He couldn't prove his heritage.
Couldn't prove his heritage. Part of it,
I think what you're looking for is potentially,
as he's most likely a eunuch, since that was the cupbearers were eunuchs. What did the Bible say about eunuchs in the temple? They couldn't present themselves at the temple. Nehemiah's point, and by the way, it could be simply Nehemiah's not a priest, but it probably fits better because of what we know about the circumstance and what he's saying, is that Nehemiah was forbidden here. So here's kind of a funny thing. So Tobiah and Shambalot came up with this idea, what if we get him to get in trouble with God? What? It's kind of a strange plan for guys that have been talking about, we want to murder him. How about we get him to break the law of Moses as well? Well, why is that so significant?
Well, it says that it's to give him a bad name. That seems to discredit him among the Jews to say, look, he's breaking your law. Why he's letting them?
So what's fascinating about this idea is that it's about, he said that they might bring reproach on me, that they might have something to say, number one. Number two, number one, if he brings reproach, remember, he just did something really remarkable by shaming all the nobles and bringing everybody back to work, and everybody's saying, you know, that Nehemiah, I bet he really loves God. You know, I hear that he doesn't take his, you know, his wages. He's been paying this out of his pocket. You know, yeah, he loaned my uncle grain, and he's a real devout guy. And then he walked in the temple when we all knew he came. Suddenly there's a problem, number one. Number two, though, there's a second part here. I don't think this is actually their plan, but I kind of wonder. You know, go back to Balaam and Balak, back in the book of Numbers. And Balaam went to curse Israel. Remember, how did that work out for him? Not great. But then Balaam did something extraordinarily horrible that did curse Israel. What was it?
Oh, Mount sin.
Yes, so this is something, by the way, we find out in the New Testament, that Balaam taught Balak to, and filling in from the book of Numbers, send your girls down there from Baal, at Baal Peor, and get the Israelites to worshiping that way, sexual worship. And what's going to happen to the Israelites? God will destroy them for you. Now, I don't know if Sandblot and these guys are that smart, but wow, that would be pretty sinister if they were. You know, God's with them. Because remember what it said back at the beginning of the chapter there? When they saw we were building the wall, you know, it was, you know, in the circumstances here, he said, it was clear the way we're doing things, there were no breaks. This was a remarkable thing. What are these people going to be seeing in this? They're going to be seeing God. What does it say in verse 16? They perceived that this work was done by God. So I can't help but wonder, maybe they had a little more devious point to say, what if we can bring about a curse? Just about at our time. I know we're there. Let me jump ahead and just say we've got one more story there with Tobiah and his letters and his relationship with the high priest. Again, the last thing it says, these letters were to frighten me. Have you noticed how many times in this chapter that was used? To frighten me, to frighten us, to make us afraid. Fear-mongering. What is fear-mongering? Intimidation by trying to get us to see the worst of things to come. And we saw it 3 times. Now, by the way, there was another kind of fear here. What was the other fear? Contrast. Fear of the Lord. And I find it fascinating, and I really wish I had set us a little more time to talk about this, to say that these readings tonight were all about trying to scare people. Now, why am I thinking about that today, 2022? Yeah, turn on the news. If the world doesn't blow up in the next 3 weeks, I don't know what's going to happen. You know, we're constantly inundated, even among each other, by, oh, yeah, things are bad. Things are not bad. They're going to be worse. Next week's going to be worse than this week. If I asked the question, I want you to raise your hand. If I said, how many of you think that things are going downhill and it's going to be worse for the next generation than now? I would guess every one of us raise our hand. We don't know that. And in fact, the Bible says, book of Ecclesiastes, really nothing new under the sun. But it's a funny thing about how we absorb fear. We get caught up in it, and how many things we're unwilling to do, righteous things, because somebody's gotten fear and sunk it in, and it displaced the fear of the Lord. No, I think some of these things worried Nehemiah. I think his little, in chapter 5, verse 19, remember me, God, remember these things. I think his, verse 14 of chapter 6, remember these people. He's saying, I am kind of worried, but I'm far more fearful of you, my God, than anything they can do. And that's an important point. We're at pastor time, so we'll stop here. Thanks so much. Great thoughts and comments. I really appreciate it.
Are we singing up the supplemental today?
Yes.
Is that gonna make it to the front row?
Garlock.
Mark it around.
Doesn't really matter. There's no line. Don't even worry about that. I told him this morning he had that orange outfit and that big beard. I said, "Ooh, let's take a permit."
That went through my head too.
Yeah.
I went back on, is he working out of prison today or?
I said, did you join the Nation of Islam? I didn't know
How
what.
many hours?
Either that or a Jesuit.
Yeah.
Drinking water?
Yeah.
Next Thursday, you don't need like 2 days or tomorrow. But it's in the morning.
Yeah.